The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets about what matters most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Hey friends, it's Jonathan Rogers. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you about Short Story Summer Camp, which runs from June 20th through July 25th. We did this last year. It was so much fun, we're going to do it again. In this 6-week class, we're going to read 12 short stories by 12 different authors. That's 2 per week. We'll have a 90-minute discussion lecture as a live Zoom call on Tuesdays. You'll have writing exercises that will hopefully add up to you completing a short story over the course of this short story summer camp. You'll be in a critique group. At the end, we'll have a story time when we share our stories with one another, reading them out loud. There'll be both an adult cohort and a student cohort. Anyway, it's going to be a lot of fun. I'd love to have you there. You can find out more and register at thehabit.co/camp. Thanks a lot. Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. In this episode, the Hometown Stories series continues with a tour of California. What do you envision when you envision California? Whatever you picture, you can be sure the opposite is also true. If you picture the Pacific Coast Highway, there's also the Mojave Desert. If you picture Joshua Tree, there's also the Redwood Forest. If you picture Hollywood, there's also more agricultural land than you've ever seen in your life. If you picture Nancy Pelosi, there's also Ronald Reagan. To paraphrase Walt Whitman, California is large. It contains multitudes. So I think you'll enjoy this little tour of the Golden State, brought to you by 4 writers from the Habit membership: Gypsy Martin, Jacqueline Huselton, Kendra Bertez, and Reagan Drecke, all of whom grew up in California but found themselves elsewhere as adults. Our first story comes from Gypsy Martin. It's a memory of an educator so free-spirited and goofy that it's hard to imagine him educating anywhere besides California.
The town I grew up in was named Carpinteria, not to be confused with a local flooring chain called Carpinteria. Our town got its name in 1769 when members of a Spanish expedition encountered a Chumash village on the Southern California coast and saw a man building a canoe on the beach. The soldiers called the place Carpinteria, in English the Carpentry. The canoes were built on the beach because the Chumash lined their boats with the pitch that bubbled up naturally from the sand. Carpinterians, as we call ourselves, live with a corporeal reminder of this history. As kids, any day we spent at the beach required a ritual cleansing of the feet before we were let back in the house. I would grab a can of turpentine and a rag and scrub my soles vigorously until I couldn't stand the tickle anymore, and most of the tar had been removed. Fancy people used Johnson's baby oil for the job, but the scent of tar and turpentine reinforced my sense of having put in a good day's work in the great outdoors. The person who loomed largest over my years in Carpinteria was Raymond Hill, the principal of our public high school. I first met Mr. Hill in the summer before I went into 6th grade, when he was recruiting elementary school students to play orphans in the production of Annie he was directing at the high school. The next year, Mr. Hill came calling at the junior high when he needed novice nuns to fill out the cast of The Sound of Music. At one marathon rehearsal, we were not released to go home until we could recite the entirety of our Latin chants by memory. I can do it for you still. Rex admirabilis et triumphator nobilis, and so on. The summer before my freshman year in high school, I learned that Mr. Hill not only directed all the plays and musicals at the school, but also taught an honors class that substituted for the regular history curriculum. He asked me if I wanted to do an optional summer assignment for the class, which would give me a leg up in the fall. When I said, sure, he handed me a copy of The Source by James Michener, a 1,000-page-long novel about the history of Israel, beginning in the Stone Age. Accompanying that was a yellow legal pad upon which he had scrawled several questions for me to answer from each section of the book. It appeared to be a bespoke assignment, and the weeks went by, and I read and I wrote with no end in sight, and I started to wonder if I had somehow misunderstood. The book and the yellow legal pad went with me everywhere that summer, and on the first day of school I handed them back to Mr. Hill, along with a sheaf of notebook paper upon which I had written my answers. Once class got underway, I came to understand that I'd given my entire summer to earning extra credit that I didn't need. Not to say that the experience was without its benefits. Reading The Source helped bring the Old Testament to life for me, even if its unflinching depiction of human sacrifice haunted me for years. And after the Herculean effort required for that assignment, my normal workload seemed quite manageable in comparison. In high school, I got to know Mr. Hill better. He spoke fluent Spanish, and he loved Don Quixote. Both his office and home were decorated with Quixote-themed art. His personal look could best be described as disheveled professional. His necktie hung only about halfway to his low-slung pants, over a stomach that strained the limits of his shirt buttons. At some point I realized Mr. Hill was Catholic and that his faith deeply informed his character. He always found the kids on the fringes and made sure they knew they mattered and belonged. I took both of the classes he taught every semester for all 4 years. Mr. Hill enjoyed a seemingly unlimited amount of freedom in his role as an educator. In winter, he took his classes on trips to Big Bear to ski, and in the spring, he took us camping on Catalina Island. He always found jobs around campus for kids like me who couldn't afford the trips otherwise. He arranged field trips to Los Angeles so we could see the Broadway tours of Les Miserables and Phantom of the Opera, and he hosted a Dickens-themed Christmas party at his house, complete with a roast goose. One could safely say that Mr. Hill was a master at giving kids memorable experiences, but there was one year when he really outdid himself. That year we did a unit on local history, and one of our assignments was to write a research paper about the town of Summerland, our neighbor just to the north. Summerland was home to the Big Yellow House, a restaurant that my family went to when my grandparents visited and offered to foot the bill. It was a special place, and not just because my family was unaccustomed to dining out. First, the restaurant was in a Victorian-era mansion. Second, the children who dined there were weighed on an antique-style scale and charged for their meal according to what they weighed. Third, the place was absolutely haunted. I'd learned that last bit from my stepbrother Jimmy, who'd learned it from his friend Gino, who'd learned it from his brother Leonard, who had been a server at the Big Yellow House. Leonard had seen dishes fly across the room and break into pieces, all on their own. Others had seen the ghostly figure of a woman in the hallways. Just about everybody knew somebody who had seen something spooky at the Big Yellow House. When I started reading about the founding of Summerland for school, the tales of hauntings began to make a lot more sense. I learned that in the 1880s, H.L. Williams purchased the 1,000-acre Ortega Ranch. He subdivided the property and advertised the lots for sale to fellow spiritualists around the country as a place where they could come and practice their religion in peace. The town was not named after its beach location, as I'd assumed, but after a plane in the spiritualist afterlife that is loosely analogous to the Christian idea of heaven. Williams himself had lived in a large house overlooking the ocean where he often held seances. This house was purchased by an entrepreneurial couple in the early 1970s, painted an offensive shade of yellow, and opened for business as a restaurant. Much to my disappointment, I had never experienced anything inexplicable at the Big Yellow House, apart from the uncannily good whipped honey butter they served alongside their cornbread. But that was potentially about to change. I was wrapping up the research for my paper when Mr. Hill announced that we would be investigating the haunted history of Summerland firsthand. As he passed around permission slips, he told us that we would be holding a seance led by a local medium at the Big Yellow House, and then we would spend the night at the restaurant. You can imagine the energy that bubbled over when 20-plus teenagers arrived at the Big Yellow House, toting sleeping bags and air mattresses. The thought of a co-ed sleepover was thrilling enough, but add in an unorthodox location and potential ghosts and or poltergeists, and we were giddy with excitement. Alas, that excitement fizzled out very quickly. I can now confidently tell you that there are few things more boring than an unsuccessful seance. Even my feelings of acute secondhand embarrassment for the medium faded after the first 5 minutes. As we students fidgeted in our seats and snuck covert glances at one another across the circle, it felt like an eternity. At last, one of the adults called it, and we were set free to socialize and play games until lights out. The sleepover itself turned out to be as anticlimactic as the seance. There was not a whisper of paranormal activity. Even the kids who managed to stay up all night saw nothing out of the ordinary. The thrilling conclusion I had envisioned for my paper had failed to materialize. The only pushback Mr. Hill got for our unorthodox field trip was from one Reverend Gates, whose daughter attended our school. Mr. Hill invited him to come speak to our class. Reverend Gates had an unkempt beard and slightly wild eyes and spoke to us at length from the scriptures about the sinfulness of using a medium to contact the spirit world. As a Christian myself, I had to concede that the man had a point, but I was thankful that this bit of education had come after the fact. Without Mr. Hill in my life, I never would have gone downhill skiing, or played Dolly Levi on stage, or participated in a mock congress in Washington, D.C. After I graduated from high school, I waited too long to try to get back in touch with him, and he died before I could adequately express to him how much his belief in me had changed my life for the better. Thanks to my Carpinteria High School education, I know it would be A, ineffective, and B, wrong to attempt to communicate this to Mr. Hill via a medium. But the years fly by these days, and I know it won't be long until I can tell him myself in our brighter, better Summerland.
Jacqueline Hazelton lives in Germany, but she grew up in Fresno, California. A whole continent, an ocean, and half another continent had given Jacqueline the distance she needed to be able to see what's so special about the place where she grew up.
My hometown tastes like corn tortillas and carne asada. It feels like the sting in my nostrils when I walk into Grandma's kitchen and breathe in the air of the freshly ground salsa. My hometown is the dust that pulls around my ankles as I walk across the fields and 1,000 acres of vineyards, field workers, tractors, and flatbed trucks. My hometown is 100-degree dry heat in the summer, never-ending pool parties, and soccer tournaments that burn my already brown skin to a crisp. My hometown is, "Hey, mija, have you seen my chanclas?" Or, "Can you warm up the comal?" I became a writer in Germany. This is where my tongue shook loose and I found my voice. And yet, living in the beautiful fairy tale town that I do, all I find myself writing about is the hometown that I came from. I find myself reflecting on it in everything I write. That place is an ocean away, a dusty town called Fresno, California. Whenever I share this with a Californian from the Bay Area, LA, or SoCal, I say it with a hint of embarrassment. There are a lot of jokes about Fresno. Some call it the armpit of California, mixing it up with another similarly hot and sticky Central Valley town. Like many other American cities, Fresno has clear socioeconomic divides. The mostly white upper class continuously builds north. Suburban cookie-cutter housing developments, outdoor shopping malls, and high-end stores spill over into the once farmed northern lands. Urban blight plagues the city center, and the south and west side is troubled with gang violence and crime. Further south, you'll hit the rural farmlands and vineyards that are slowly being abandoned. Land once bought for $200,000, now worth millions, sold to trucking companies looking for a place to park their semis near the freeway to serve the click-and-ship culture we've become. This land, once sacred to pioneering farmers, fertile and fruitful, think Steinbeck, is now bought and sold with oil stains seeping into the soil. Drive past the gas stations in Brooks Steiner, and 10 minutes later you'll see my parents' house. It's the one with 2 towering palm trees on either side and a dying redwood on the right. I moved away at 24, and I often got asked why I would leave beautiful California. I'd shrug my shoulders. The only good thing about Fresno is that it's within driving distance to Yosemite, San Fran, or LA. The only good thing about Fresno are the day trips. And I used to believe that. But I've lived away from my hometown for 12 years now, mostly overseas in Europe, and if there's one thing that the expat experience has given me, it's perspective. If you want to get specific, however, I guess I'd have to recognize that I wasn't so much from Fresno as I was from the rural farmlands just outside, near Easton, California, a municipality so small that there is one hamburger stand across from the high school called Juicy Burger, and the neighborhood grocery store is called Big Potato. In Easton, the farmers ruled, and the locals will champion the saying that the San Joaquin Valley is the breadbasket of America. We feed the world, my grandfather would proudly tell me, and as a child growing up on his farm, I believed him. In this part of the world, it was tractors running at 5 a.m., beat-up cars parked along the country roads, and migrant workers dotting the fields. It was farmers meeting at the diner off the freeway for second breakfast. It was endless acres of orchards, nut trees, vineyards, and vegetable fields. It was knowing what kind of citrus your neighbor had in their backyard because you traded almonds for his lemons. It was late evenings at my best friend's peach farm, the sky wide in fading colors of pinks and pale oranges, just like the peaches and nectarines being traded for my grandfather's crimson grapes. It's sitting on the dusty truck bed on flattened cardboard boxes, convincing Dad to drive you down the street to stare at the stars on a cool summer night. It's the multicultural history of farmers with roots from Armenian, Portuguese, Japanese, Hmong, and Mexican communities. But the longer I'm away, the more I've realized that much of my hometown story starts with my late grandfather. Grandpa had a world of stories, and he'd talk to anybody. Just give him your ear, and you couldn't get him to stop. In my family, his stories are legendary. We joke about how many times he'd recycle them, and how every time, details would change. I guess that's how family legends are made. And well, to get to her house, see, he had to ride his horse over a bridge, and one day, well, her brothers had enough. They stopped him on the bridge and forced the Indian off of it. He fell and died. That's how the story goes. According to my grandpa, the family on my mom's side is as native to America as the missions that line the Pacific coast. He tells stories about a Spanish shepherd on the verdant mountains, a beautiful woman living in a hacienda, a Mexican Native American love affair, and her Spanish brothers forcing him off a bridge to stop it. But most of my grandfather's stories circled around his own hometown of Trinidad, Colorado, where his father was a coal miner. Grandpa's family lived off on a ranch too far off the grid to have electricity. They owned goats and made cheese. He called his mother a pioneer woman. Many of the stories he told me were about his first 7 years of life in Trinidad. They were detailed with how his mother would pack his lunch in a potato sack and send him up the road to a one-room school. He would tell me everything that was in that lunch, right down to the goat cheese wrapped in paper. Eventually, Grandpa's family came west to California in 1944. There was an influx of migrants since field work was plentiful. After a few harvest seasons, his family decided to stay. And though Grandpa's dream as a young man was to work in the grocery business, he ended up feeding people in a different way. After working as a delivery man for a farmer, Grandpa decided to try his hand at it. He leased some land and rented a house with an option to buy. Mixing in lots of heat, sweat, and the ceaseless work of a farmer, he expanded it into a 40-acre farming business called Lucero Farms. Eventually, Grandpa's 2 sons joined the business and it grew even more. It became the formative and bustling farmhouse of my childhood. My cousins and I grew up going there for everything. Easter egg hunts, Christmas Eve dinner, birthdays, and anniversary parties. We'd spent summer vacations exploring the grounds and playing imaginatively. My favorite thing to do was to sit in the humid hothouses right after a watering and to savor the rich scent of the soil and feel the scratchy tomato leaves growing on the vine. I chased lizards in the back patio and tried to tame wild cats. The farm is where I had my first job working at the vegetable stand in the old garage. It's where I first noticed the hardships of the world, observing diligent work from immigrant field workers and considering their life circumstances. Most of all, the farm was a place to belong to each other. It was a place for a child to observe the vision and work of enterprise while experiencing the love and acceptance of a family. It is this farm that ties me to my hometown. Now I visit Fresno every 2 years or so. And when I do, things are not exactly as I remember them. Furniture is moved, there's an upgraded television, or a new Starbucks down the block. Hometowns don't stay the same. But whenever I return, one thing is the same. My mother and grandmother get into the kitchen and start cooking. Enchiladas, tamales, salsa, guacamole, rice and beans, macaroni and potato salad. Family potato salads never change. And then the uncles, aunts, brother, nephews, and cousins gather at the farmhouse and we feast. Day trips are not the only good thing about Fresno. All those years ago, I was unable to recognize the beauty of the land, the farming life, and the culture of loyalty that came with it. Perhaps I was too close to see this properly. I have lived in foreign spaces for over 12 years now. And we've recently signed a job contract that enables us to stay in Germany for yet another season of life. And lately, I've been questioning why I'm able to live in a place that, while I'm very happy to call it my home, I know I'll never truly belong. And well, I'm pretty sure that my hometown is that reason.
In our next story, Kendra Bertez depicts a moment in Argentina when a scent memory took her back to her childhood in the outskirts of San Diego.
Where the Road Dead Ends by Kendra G. Bertez, a hometown story from the suburbs of San Diego. Salvia, Dorman says and points to one of the pots that lined the walkway porch outside her kitchen. I repeat it back to her just as she expects. Salvia. Satisfied with my Spanish pronunciation, she clutches the chain-link fence with 3 fingers. Then holding her back, she grimaces and rips off a piece. Her quivering hand then places the leaf in my palm. She eagerly nods for me to smell it. So I do. I am flooded with a moving image. Puffy white clouds and a bright blue sky are all I can see over the dashboard of my dad's old Beamer. Dad takes a right turn, just before the town's main road dead ends. The old exhaust pipe sounds even louder as Dad opens the roof window. I turn my head in all directions. A cool wind swirls around my little face, causing my eyes to close. This is one of my favorite parts of town. Actually, all of my favorite parts of town start where the paved roads stop. We move slower. The dust picks up. My slushy sloshes as the tires bump along the ruts of an uneven dirt road. It isn't long before Dad stops the car at the base of the Black Mountain and turns up the music. This is our familiar cue. My sister and I know it's time to hoist our little bodies out through the top window. We know that windy Saturday afternoons bring the hang gliders to town. For the next hour, cross-legged on the roof of my dad's car, we will watch gliding men fly like brightly colored hawks. My 5-year-old self wonders, have the men come to expect us sitting here below their feet? A sweet Argentine voice interrupts my thoughts. Do you know it? She asks and motions to the leaf still in my hand. Do I know it? Of course I know it. It's the smell of my clothes after trampling through the canyon to fetch a lost hobby rocket. Locked up in this leaf is the smell of fishing my hometown's creek and only bringing home a cup of guppies. This fragrance reminds me of watching Dad clear the brush out back so we can make a dry hill run with plywood sleds for all the neighborhood kids. But I don't say any of these things. Instead, I smile and nod yes. Standing on that shaded porch a continent away from where I grew up, I'd just been handed a piece of home. It struck me as funny how a little green leaf could take me back to San Diego, especially because for many people, the postcard picture of San Diego is all they know. A big cityscape with a world-famous bay in the foreground, a bay with a long, curved, iconic blue bridge that connects tall buildings to the quaint Coronado Island. Don't confuse where I lived with downtown San Diego. We lived quite a bit north of there. You'd get off the interstate at Rancho Penasquitos Boulevard and find yourself in an island suburb. An island not surrounded by water, but by canyon. My dad said we lived close to the ocean, but the quickest route to the beach was by the dirt road through the strawberry fields. It took a well-running car and a half an hour to get there. This was not my mother's or I's definition of close. Rancho Penasquitos smelled of salt and sea, only faintly. Mostly, it smelled of California coastal sage. Before tossing the leaf aside, I noticed its bright green color and wideness, different from my coastal sage. The South American equivalent might have tricked me if I hadn't smelled it. A scent lingers on my fingers, then pulling my youngest little girl into my arms, I squeeze her tight. The elderly woman asks me, "What's her second name?" I say, Arami. The woman smiles warmly. She is a foreigner. Her and I have this in common, but this is one of the words we've both learned from the local Paraguayan language. The word brings the eyes of my 1-year-old to search for my attention. I lean my head forward, playfully bearing it into her small body, and say, "Sage, Arami." Delighted to hear her own name spoken, I repeat it again, this time in English. Sage, little piece of heaven.
I first met Reagan Dregge when she took one of my online writing classes almost 10 years ago. She wrote a little piece about her childhood in Bakersfield, California, a major destination for Dust Bowl Okies looking for agricultural work, and the birthplace of Merle Haggard, which was his real name, by the way, not a stage name. What I'm saying is that there was once a baby named Merle Haggard, and he was born in Bakersfield, California. Buck Owens lived in Bakersfield too. It's where he built his Crystal Palace Concert Hall. Anyway, Reagan, who now lives in Minnesota, where she fits right in the best possible ways, seemed insufficiently impressed with her old hometown, and I told her so. She's had nearly 10 years to think better of her dismissive attitude. Her reflection on Bakersfield takes the form of letters, real letters that Reagan wrote by hand, stamped and mailed to real friends and loved ones.
Dear Sarah, why do I feel such resistance to writing a hometown story about Bakersfield? Was it the smothering smog, the sun-bleached sidewalks, the searing seatbelts, the chain link signs warning, "Stay out, stay alive"? What made me yearn with Luke Skywalker to spurn the sweaty hive and pursue the shimmering mirage of other planets? Those valley years stand in such stark contrast to the lush Four Seasons where I make home now. The enormity of the prairie sky swallows up all the dust of those desert years. I don't want to go back. Admittedly, you and I would never have become pen pals if 2,000 miles hadn't divided us. We'd never have folded squares of paper diagonally and turned up the corners to make the ears and noses of puppy faces to mail inside envelopes decorated with stickers and postage stamps. I might never have memorized your addresses. All these years and streets later, I remember every street we lived on. Shamrock, Anger, Stein, Landfair. I remember the house numbers too. 1711, 11007, 8247, 6405. Because I've always kept account of such things. But most of all, the trees. Magnolia, orange, almond, lemon, palm, pine, pomegranate, fig, and grapefruit. At our first house, I could just barely hang from the lowest branches of the southern magnolia in the front yard. I'd collect the huge, creamy petals that fell to the ground after blooming. Those were taco shells, which I'd fill with the cherry red seeds from the magnolia cones and serve on a glossy magnolia leaf plate. Our next house was an acreage with 5 orange trees. That December, we loaded a hefty bag with ripe citrus and brought it back with us to Iowa to fill all the cousins' stockings. Once, when we lived on the outskirts of town, Spanish-speaking women knocked at our door to ask if they could pick the green almonds off the pair of trees that grew along our driveway. The branches were laden with fuzz-coated, fleshy green pods, and the ladies filled up their plastic sacks and showed us how they could be eaten raw, from the firm, fuzzy rind to the soft, white meat of the seed. Crisp and chewy, fresh and tart. When I was in high school, Mom filed for divorce and moved next to a golf course. The neighbors had swimming pools. Her house had a boarded-over jacuzzi and a sandy dog run with a lemon tree. Dad moved into a house a few blocks away, so us kids could go back and forth and only need to cross one major street, Ming Avenue. I could walk or bike down Ming about a mile to the Southwest Branch Library. I knew no greater solace than running my hand along the spines of the J-thick shelves where so many favorites lived. I often wrote you about them. Then, that teaser trailer plunged me into Tolkien, and then came that morning long past midnight, tangled in a sheet on my dad's couch when I sobbed through the final pages of Return of the King. I carried the volumes with me to read wherever my family dragged me. Bleachers, waiting rooms, the car in the blast of the AC. I couldn't get enough of words and names and stories. I doubt I ever will. Your Mellon. Dear Meggie, how are the infernal fires of Florida? What is bringing you relief? Green is seeping back into the prairie while I am trying to write about Bakersfield, a place foreign to moisture. What do I do with my wanting to turn away from the traffic vibrations and the heat glare and the bike tire flattening thorns in every pavement crack, the black widow webs rimming crawl spaces and garbage can handles, the protected owl burrows dotting outfields? Did you ever want to turn away from some place or someone? Your taxidermist cousins would have taken the horny hide and bones and turned it into a tool or curiosity. Your Grandma Aldora would make a quilt from the patches of scraps and cast-offs. When you wrote me from grad school saying Annie Dillard reminded you of me, did you mean how she wrote a whole book about a ditch? I guess Bakersfield is my ditch. I better look closer. Please send more paint and wallpaper swatches, more Sylvia Plath and James Joyce on the back of receipts. I'm neck deep in appraisals and Flannery O'Connor over here. Your ever-loving Pink. Dear Brett, our mutual snow love is such a comfort to me every season of the year. It's obvious now I never could have married someone who didn't share in my affection. It only snowed once during all those winters in Bakersfield, you know. In January 1999, the city survived a shortage of mittens and disposable cameras for nearly a week. Fog delays and tumbleweeds were regular run-of-the-mill phenomena, and earthquakes were expected. But truly exciting weather was in sad supply out west. Lightning and rainbows were practically unheard of, which could be why I was so thrilled by their appearance over the cornfields the summer day you proposed. Bakersfield boys were all right as friends, but I never met any whose loves aligned with mine the way yours do. Maybe they just seemed too much like brothers, immature goof-offs or rough-and-tumble competitors. Maybe I'd have thought the same about boys anywhere, merely as bothersome distractions from immersing myself in a good story. How strange it still strikes me that I fell in love with screenplays and scripts down the road from Hollywood, only to trade away film school acceptance for the chance to study writing in a tiny Iowa town. What a brash, guilt-ridden girl you befriended in scenic design class. Your MMTF. Dear Kristen, I still can't believe we actually saw the aurora last night. Can you? No words do it justice, let alone photo or video. And yet I can't help but try to make a record of the stunning, swirling, rippling, dancing flames of light, which are actually definitely like shining from shook foil. In Bakersfield, city light pollution combined with air pollution to block most of the stars out. It was on late-night walks back on the farm my cousins would point out the Big Dipper and the Milky Way and Orion's Belt. Walks in the summer during detasseling season, walks in the winter after ringing in the new year. In the Midwest, the stars were clear and close up. Bakersfield basked under a sole heavenly sphere. Sunglasses were a necessity and shade was scarce. Sap-shedding pines draped over curbs here and there, but desert shrubs were never famous for their cover. Palm trees lined every promenade and parking lot. But nubby poles with razor-rough bark aren't exactly the symbol of oasis those Egyptians fanning Yul Brynner in the Ten Commandments make them out to be. The water was piped in by aqueduct from Lake Isabella, whence concrete canals carried currents across the city. The sandy bed of the Kern River coursed alongside parks and bike trails, usually wide and dry as Israel's path through the Red Sea. Instead of rivers and lakes, kids splashed in chlorine swimming pools. Backyard pool parties were a summer staple, and summer stretched from March to January. My family enjoyed the luxury of an above-ground pool for a short period once before the filter broke and algae coated its tropical blue lining. Most of the time, we had to endure the sting of lawn sprinklers when we sought refreshment. Mechanical nozzles on timers shot up out of the landscaping to squirt passers-by unaware and drench the sidewalk while nearby grass shriveled in the sun. Due to that bristle-sharp grass, sidewalks that burn the skin off the bottom of bare feet, and dirt swarming with spurs, spikes, and fire ants, most of us adopted a survival technique known as flip-flops. Your fellow post office pilgrim. Dear Allison, your comment keeps rolling around in my head about how we each remember a place differently. My siblings' viewpoint surely differed from mine. They all turned into athletes, while I was the lone bookworm, hunched over my library book behind the dugout, biding the daylight hours until I could crawl into my bunk bed and relive stories in my head. All I ever did as a kid was make stuff. I'd wake up with the burning desire to bake mud cookie surprises or build a new partition in my playhouse. The first thing I did every time we moved was to scout out a playhouse location. When the itch to explore hit, I'd rollerblade around the school parking lot, looking for quarters, or climb up on the roof. When I was 11, we lived on a former horse property. The horse pens had been mostly cleared when the horses left, but when we moved in, we had to help Dad dig out a couple last posts before we planted grass for our own field of dreams. A brush pile and a manure pile were heaped back by the old horse sheds we kids had each staked claim to. The brush pile was like a forest you could forge through and come out the other side with only a few tears in your play clothes to prove your toughness. The manure pile was perfect for daredevil stunts on a bicycle. My 3-year-old sister discovered a fire ant nest in the manure pile by sitting on it. And then she discovered that the treatment for getting fire ant bites all over was a cold baking soda bath, and she wailed during both. A train track ran behind our back fence at that house. One of my cousins visited once and woke up in the middle of the night, sure she was about to die underneath an airplane landing on the roof. But we'd all slept soundly through the commotion and got to hear about her near-death experience over breakfast. Your eternal friend. Dear Elizabeth, I've saved yours for last. 9 years ago this summer, I scraped up my pennies to take an online writing class called Close to the Earth. One of the class assignments was to write about place. I don't remember what all I wrote about Bakersfield, but I remember getting multiple paragraphs of feedback from JR. His notes turned out to be more related to his nostalgia for country music than my lack of nostalgia for a hometown, but he was probably just showing me how to write about the things we love. Of course you were right to call me to stay. Bakersfield's smog was like a curtain I couldn't bear to draw back, but I've begun to squint after the blurry shapes beyond the veil, thanks to vampires, vampire blood, and other sad stories told for laughs. My sackcloth is sloughing its scratchiness for shimmers of silk. As a teenager, sinking in a loss I couldn't escape, all I could do was cling to the cloaks of hobbits crawling through shadow. In my notebook, I drew a picture of Sam in the Orc Tower, torn from his dearest friend. It wasn't really him, though, huddled there at the dead end of darkness. It was me. It was me whose heart had broken. Me who had lost everything when my fairy tale of a whole family shattered. It was me who, in the lonely dark, could only sing about the good green home I had known and longed for. Long for still, even now, living in my Minnesota Shire. And longing will lead me all the days of my life, I think, through valleys and deserts and dry riverbeds, all the way home. In your kindness, Elizabeth, you pointed out the prickly palms and December oranges that grow in the desert. Your tenderness spurred me to search out the truer truth bound up in each grain of sand. You turned toward my wilderness with me. A wilderness where rain pattered once a year, and once a year was enough to teach me the smell. From my porch shore to yours.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.